I never imagined that silence could be so loud, the kind that settles into the walls after the wedding photos come down and the phone stops ringing, the kind that makes you sit at the kitchen table long after your tea has gone cold, staring at a chair that no one pulls out anymore. When my son chose his new life, he didn't announce it with cruelty. He didn't shout or curse or slam the door. He simply stopped needing me, and somehow that hurt more than any harsh word ever could. I remember the day he told me he was getting married. He stood right there in my living room, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, smiling like a boy who knew he was stepping into something big. I hugged him and cried the good kind of tears, the kind mothers cry when they believe their love has multiplied instead of been divided. I told him how proud I was. I meant it with every part of my heart. After the wedding, things changed in small ways at first. The calls became shorter. The visits turned into holidays only. When I asked how he was doing, his answers felt rehearsed, like he was already halfway out the door, even through the phone. I told myself this was normal. People grow up, lives expand, mothers learn to step back. That's what I kept repeating to quiet the ache that had started to settle in my chest. I tried to be respectful. I didn't want to crowd him or make his wife feel uncomfortable. I remembered how delicate new marriages could be, so I waited for invitations instead of offering help. I asked before stopping by. I chose my words carefully, trimming my concern down to something neat and polite. I told myself this was love too, learning when to be quiet. But silence has a way of teaching you things you didn't ask to learn. Weeks turned into months, and I realized I was always the one reaching out, always the one saying, just checking in, or I made your favorite dish today and thought of you. Sometimes he answered, sometimes he didn't. When he did, his voice sounded distracted, like I was interrupting a life that no longer had space for me. I watched from a distance as his world filled up with new routines, new traditions, new people who knew him in ways I never would. I told myself I should be grateful that he was happy, and I was, truly. But happiness doesn't cancel out loneliness, it just makes it harder to admit. I began to feel like a chapter he had already finished reading, set gently aside without realizing I was still alive inside the story. The first time I realized how far I had slipped from his life, it was raining. A steady, quiet rain that soaked into everything. I had fallen in my kitchen, nothing serious, just a scare. My hand was shaking when I picked up the phone to call him. It rang and rang before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I sat on the floor and waited for the shaking to stop, feeling foolish for expecting anything else. Later that night, he texted, asked if I was okay. I typed back that I was fine, because that's what mothers do. We smooth over our pain so our children don't feel it. We become experts at swallowing words that might make them uncomfortable. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was still strong, that I didn't need to be needed. But the truth crept in slowly, like the light at the end of a long day. I wasn't part of his decisions anymore. I wasn't consulted, informed, or even considered. I found out about things after they had already happened. Moves, plans, milestones, always after, always late, like an afterthought wrapped in politeness. I began to question myself in ways I never had before. Had I asked for too much? Had I held on too tightly without realizing it? Or had I simply outlived my usefulness in his eyes? Those thoughts kept me awake at night, replaying every conversation, every choice I had made raising him. Mothers are good at blaming themselves. We carry responsibility like it's stitched into our bones. What hurt most was not being needed, but not being missed. There is a difference. Need fades with time. Missing someone means they still live in your heart. I started to feel like I was fading from his, and no matter how much I tried to stand tall and accept it with grace, there were moments when I felt invisible, like a ghost haunting a life that had moved on without me. I still set the table for two sometimes out of habit. I still buy his favorite cereal without thinking. These small, foolish acts of love don't disappear just because the person you love has changed. They linger. They wait. And on the nights when the house is too quiet, they sit beside you, reminding you of what once was and what no longer is. I didn't know then that this silence was only the beginning. I didn't know how much further he would drift, or how deeply it would test my sense of worth. All I knew was that something precious had shifted, and I was standing on the wrong side of it, trying to understand how loving someone so completely could still leave you alone. I tried to adjust, to reshape my days around the absence instead of fighting it. I told myself this was what strong women did. They adapted, they found new routines, they didn't cling to the past like a lifeline. So I filled my calendar with small things, morning walks, library visits, church on Sundays, even when I didn't feel like speaking to anyone. I smiled when people asked about my son. I said he was busy, married life was keeping him occupied. I said it proudly, like his distance was proof that I had done my job well. But pride is a fragile thing when it's built on loss. Each time I spoke his name out loud, I felt the space where he used to be. I noticed how conversations shifted when I entered a room alone. People assumed I was lonely, even when they were polite enough not to say it, and maybe I was. Loneliness has a way of settling into your posture, into the way you pause before answering simple questions. The first holiday after his marriage came and went quietly. I cooked too much food, out of habit again, and packed the leftovers into containers that stayed in my fridge until they spoiled. He sent a message late in the evening, a simple, "Hope you had a good day." No call, no visit. I typed back a heart emoji and stared at the screen long after it went dark. I tried not to compare myself to his wife, but comparisons have a way of sneaking in when you're already feeling small. I wondered what she saw when she looked at me. An old woman with opinions? A reminder of a life before her? Or just someone unnecessary now that she had claimed her place beside him? I never gave voice to these thoughts. I tucked them away like embarrassing secrets. When I did see them together, I felt like a guest in my own history. They had inside jokes I didn't understand, plans they discussed without including me. I laughed when they laughed, nodded when they spoke, careful not to linger too long on any one topic. I wanted to be pleasant, easy, forgettable if that's what it took to stay welcome. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when I wanted to say, "I miss you," or "I feel like I've lost you." But the words always caught in my throat. I was afraid of sounding needy, afraid of confirming whatever quiet judgment I imagined had already been made about me. So I stayed silent, believing that love meant stepping aside. Time has a way of exposing the cracks you try to ignore. I began to notice how rarely my phone buzzed. Days would pass without a single message. When I reached out, his replies came hours later, short and efficient. He sounded tired, preoccupied. I told myself he had a right to be. Marriage brings responsibilities. I didn't want to add myself to the list of burdens he was learning to carry. But the word burden started to echo in my mind in ways that frightened me. I wondered if that was how he saw me now. Not as his mother, but as something heavy he had already lifted once and didn't want to pick up again. The thought made my chest ache. I had spent my life making sure he never felt like a burden to me, and now I was terrified of becoming one to him. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation at the grocery store, two women talking about their sons, about grandchildren, about Sunday dinners filled with noise and laughter. I smiled politely as I passed them, then sat in my car and cried with the engine off. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was grief for something I thought I would have, something I had quietly expected as a reward for all the years I had poured into motherhood. I started to ask myself hard questions in the quiet of my home. Who was I now if I wasn't needed? What did my life look like if my role had ended without warning? I had spent decades being someone's anchor. Now I felt like I was drifting, untethered, unsure where to place my love. Still, I didn't blame him. Not out loud, not even in my heart at first. I blamed time, change, life, anything that allowed me to preserve the image of my son as kind and thoughtful. It felt safer that way, easier than admitting that he had made a choice, and that choice did not include me. Looking back, I see how carefully I avoided the truth. I see how I shrank myself to fit into the corners of his new life. I thought if I took up less space, there would be room for me. I didn't understand then that love doesn't work that way. You don't earn your place by disappearing. I was still trying to be patient when the next shift came. The one that would make it impossible to pretend everything was fine. At the time, I didn't know it would change the way I saw my son forever. I only knew that something inside me was growing tired of waiting and that the silence I had learned to live with was about to speak much louder. The first sign came quietly, almost imperceptibly. He stopped asking about my day, the small texts that used to punctuate my mornings. "Good morning, Mum. Don't forget your tea," disappeared. When I reached out, his responses were curt, clipped, a few words typed without warmth or elaboration. I told myself he was busy, that the responsibilities of a new marriage were enough to consume him, but deep down, I felt the sting, the slow erosion of our connection. It was a Saturday afternoon when it hit me fully. I had invited him and his wife for lunch, a simple meal, nothing extravagant. I cleaned the house, set the table with care, even put flowers in a vase, imagining the smiles on their faces. But when the time came, I received a text. "Sorry, we're busy today. That's all. No alternative, no explanation, just a flat refusal that made my heart twist in ways I wasn't prepared for." I didn't cry at first. I put down my phone, sat in the living room, and watched the sunlight fall across the floor, feeling a strange mixture of anger and disbelief. How could someone you love so deeply, someone who once could not wait to see you, simply decide you weren't needed? The thought repeated in my mind like a broken record, each repetition sharper than the last. I tried to reason with myself. Marriage changes priorities, I told myself. Responsibilities shift. Life moves on. But reason is a poor comfort when your heart feels abandoned. I realized that no matter how much I tried to understand, the empty space he left was a silent accusation. It whispered, "You are no longer my world." That evening I sat alone at the dinner table. The food I had prepared for 4 became a meal for 1. I thought about calling a friend, but I didn't want to voice my sadness to anyone else, didn't want to put my pain into words that might make it seem smaller or petty. So I ate in silence, the clinking of my fork against the plate louder than any voice could have been. Sleep offered no escape. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying memories of his childhood, his first steps, the way he laughed when he was happy, the nights I stayed up waiting for him to come home from school. All those moments seemed distant now, almost foreign, like another life I had only observed from afar. I realized painfully that time had not just moved forward for him, it had moved him away. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in my own behavior. I stopped planning events, stopped imagining moments when we would be together. I avoided checking social media because every photo of them together was a reminder of the distance I could not cross. I started speaking less about him, even to friends who asked. The pride I once carried began to feel like a fragile mask, and I was too tired to keep it in place. Yet, even in the silence, I searched for signs of him in my life. A phone call, a message, a small gesture that said he still thought of me, but they were rare, and when they came, they were perfunctory, devoid of emotion. Each brief contact felt like both a blessing and a punishment. I clung to it, even as it reminded me of how much had changed. I began writing letters I never sent, pouring out my feelings onto paper. I told him how much I missed him, how the house felt emptier without his laughter, how I wished I could be part of his new life without intruding. The act of writing brought relief, even if the words remained unshared. The letters became a mirror, reflecting a truth I wasn't ready to speak aloud, that I felt left behind, forgotten, replaced. Friends noticed the change in me. They asked if I was all right, and I assured them I was, but their questions, though kind, felt like another echo of the same absence. They reminded me that everyone else assumed I had moved on, that I was coping, that I was fine. In reality, coping was a performance, a careful act of holding myself together even when my heart felt frayed. One rainy afternoon, I walked through the park near my home. The drops splashed against my coat, mingling with the tears I didn't bother to hide. I watched families together, couples walking hand in hand, children running to parents who smiled at them. Each scene was a quiet, painful reminder of what I had lost, or perhaps of what I had never fully realized I needed. The rain didn't cleanse or soothe, it mirrored the quiet despair I carried inside. But in that dreary moment, I also felt a flicker of something else. Awareness. Not acceptance, not yet, but the first faint recognition that life would not pause for my grief. That if I wanted to survive, I would need to navigate this new reality, find meaning even in the distance, even in the silence. I began to notice myself differently. The mirror reflected more than just an older woman. It reflected someone who had given endlessly, who had loved without condition, who had built a life around another human being. And yet, it also showed someone unprepared for loss, someone who had not anticipated being pushed aside. This duality, of strength and vulnerability, became the lens through which I viewed every interaction with him. The weeks turned into months, and patterns became clearer. He didn't hate me, that I knew, but he had chosen a new path, one where I wasn't central. I realized that love alone was not enough to guarantee presence. Choices mattered, and his choice, deliberate or not, had reshaped the landscape of my life. One evening I received a brief message from him. "How are you?" It was ordinary, but my heart raced. I typed back a careful reply, one that didn't betray the storm inside me. The exchange was polite, surface level, but it was contact. And contact, even when thin and fragile, reminded me that our bond, though altered, was not entirely broken. That night, I sat in the quiet of my home, reflecting on what I had learned. I learned that love can be patient, but patience has limits. I learned that absence doesn't erase attachment, but it does demand adaptation. And most importantly, I learned that my identity could not rely solely on being needed. There was more to me than my role as a mother, more than the comfort of proximity, more than the expectation of being included. The first time I truly faced the depth of my loneliness, it wasn't in a dramatic moment or a confrontation. It was in the quiet of my own home, sitting in the armchair he used to love, the fabric still slightly worn from years of use, and realizing that the warmth it once held was now absent. I traced my fingers along the edges of the cushion, and memories cascaded. Birthday mornings, school projects spread across the floor, late-night talks when life seemed complicated for both of us. Every memory was sharp, bittersweet, and unavoidable. I tried to fill the void. I took up old hobbies I had abandoned, read books I had meant to finish, even experimented with cooking new recipes. Yet each attempt felt muted, incomplete. The laughter I had imagined while trying a new dish or reading a captivating story lacked the echo of shared joy. The world had continued spinning, but the rhythm I had danced to with my son was gone. It was during one particularly long evening that I realized something crucial. My grief wasn't just about missing him, it was about losing the version of him that existed only with me. The version that depended on our relationship as a mother and son. That version had been replaced by a new identity, molded by marriage, by partnership, by the subtle and unspoken adjustments he made to fit his new life. And I was left outside that new reality, watching from a distance I could neither cross nor shorten. At first, the temptation to intervene, to force reconnection, was overwhelming. I found myself drafting messages, second-guessing every word, rewriting them dozens of times before deleting them. Should I ask to meet? Should I suggest a family outing? Each idea seemed reasonable in my mind, but when faced with the reality of sending it, fear and doubt paralyzed me. What if he rejected the attempt outright? What if my longing for closeness became a source of tension instead? So I retreated. I withdrew into routines that felt safe, familiar. I organized my home, tending to things I had ignored in my preoccupation with his upbringing. I reconnected with friends I hadn't spoken to in months, rekindling bonds that had faded while my attention had been focused elsewhere. Gradually, the emptiness began to feel less like an abyss and more like a space I could inhabit without collapsing. Yet, every ritual, every distraction was still haunted by the same question. Why had it become so easy for him to leave, not just physically, but emotionally? The life we had shared had once been inseparable, and now the connection was fraying, threads pulled taut, threatening to snap entirely. I realized that part of my pain stemmed not from loss alone, but from the speed and finality of it. A sudden divorce from the past, as if the years we had spent together could be erased with a single choice. One afternoon, I decided to confront the feeling rather than avoid it. I sat down with pen and paper again, writing as though he were sitting across from me, listening. I didn't restrain myself. I allowed the rawness of my emotions to flow freely. I wrote about the lunches that never happened, the texts left unanswered, the milestones I had watched from a distance. I wrote about my longing, my confusion, my anger, and for the first time in months, the act of articulation offered a fragile sense of release. The next day, I forced myself into the world outside my home. I visited a local cafe, listened to strangers' conversations, smiled at familiar faces. I noticed small acts of kindness, a barista remembering my favorite coffee, a neighbor sharing a laugh over a passing dog, and for a moment the sharp edges of my grief dulled. It was a subtle revelation. Life continued, even when your personal narrative felt paused, even when your heart ached with absence. But the evenings were always the hardest. They were when I expected him to call, when I imagined him returning to the home I still carried in my memory. The silence was louder then, a heavy physical thing pressing against my chest. Sometimes I allowed myself to cry. Other times I read old letters, keeping his words close even as the current reality seemed to contradict them. There was a strange duality in this practice. I was simultaneously holding on and letting go, nurturing memory while confronting absence. I began noticing small patterns in my own reactions. When I saw a mother and son laughing together, I felt a pang of jealousy, followed by a flash of understanding. The connection I had with him was unique, and it existed in a space I could still honor, even if it had shifted. I learned to distinguish between longing for the past and despair over the present. That distinction, subtle yet powerful, became a guiding principle in my attempts to navigate this new dynamic. Slowly, I experimented with reaching out again, not in desperation, but in measured, intentional ways. A short message to ask about a hobby he had recently taken up, a comment on a photo he posted, a note of appreciation for something he had accomplished. The responses were polite, occasionally warm, sometimes distant. But each interaction, however small, reminded me that while the closeness we once had changed, it had not vanished entirely. There were days when I resented him openly, and I did not shy away from acknowledging that emotion. I told myself it was natural to feel anger alongside grief. After all, rejection, whether conscious or not, hurts. It is a deeply human reaction. But I also reminded myself that resentment, left unchecked, could become corrosive, not just toward him, but toward myself. To carry bitterness constantly would be to let his absence define my own life. In this period of reflection, I discovered the importance of balance. I had to find ways to honor my feelings without letting them consume me. Meditation, journaling, long walks in the evenings, they became tools to anchor myself. I began noticing the quiet beauty of ordinary life, the way sunlight filtered through trees, the gentle rhythm of rain on the window, the laughter of neighbors' children playing nearby. These small moments offered proof that life still held joy, even amidst loss. At times I wondered if he noticed the subtle shifts in me. Would he recognize that I was no longer the anxious, ever-present mother, constantly seeking closeness, but someone who had learned to occupy her own space? And if he did notice, how would it affect our interactions? I understood that his new life required new boundaries, and my growth meant respecting them, even when it pained me. The turning point came unexpectedly. One evening he visited unannounced. I wasn't prepared. I had not cleaned the house meticulously, had not planned a conversation. He stood in the doorway, hesitant, and for a moment neither of us spoke. But in that silence there was recognition, acknowledgement of the distance and the bond that remained. We talked, awkwardly at first, then more naturally. The conversation revealed a mix of his own struggles, adjustments, and the love that persisted despite the shift in our relationship. That visit didn't erase the months of absence or the pain I had felt, but it marked a subtle reconciliation with reality. I realized that relationships evolve, sometimes in ways that feel alien or even painful. My son's marriage had changed him, changed us, but it didn't nullify the years of connection we shared. It simply required adaptation, patience, and a willingness to accept new forms of closeness. By learning to live with the tension between love and absence, I discovered resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I learned that being left behind didn't mean being unworthy, nor did it signify the end of joy. It meant that life, in its relentless forward motion, would carve new spaces for growth, reflection, and understanding. And in that awareness, I began to see the potential for a relationship not defined solely by proximity, but by mutual respect, recognition, and enduring love. The weeks following that visit became a period of careful adjustment. I realized that I could no longer measure our relationship by the old standards, the daily chats, the shared meals, the effortless presence, but instead by subtler signs of connection. A short text asking how I was, a brief phone call sharing something mundane yet meaningful, even a social media comment. All these gestures became markers of a bond that had shifted but not disappeared. I began to cherish them, learning to find depth in brevity and significance in small acts of recognition. I also started noticing how my own identity had changed in this process. For so long, I had defined myself almost exclusively through my role as a mother, through the constant caretaking, the worry, the planning, the celebrating. But with him now living a separate life, I had to confront the parts of myself that had lain dormant. Who was I outside of this role? What did I want to pursue now that the central focus of my daily life had moved away? These questions were unsettling at first, but gradually they became invitations to rediscover myself. Art became a refuge. I started sketching, painting, and even experimenting with sculpture, something I had always been curious about but never allowed myself the time for. These creative exercises weren't about producing masterpieces. They were about expressing emotions I hadn't fully processed, about externalizing grief, frustration, and love in a tangible form. I realized that by giving form to these feelings, I was able to look at them more clearly, to understand them without being swallowed by them. I also returned to volunteering, something I had enjoyed before parenthood fully consumed my time. Helping others, contributing to my community, and connecting with people outside my immediate family offered a renewed sense of purpose. I discovered that the energy I had invested entirely in my son could now ripple outward, creating small, meaningful impacts elsewhere. It was a lesson in resilience and redistribution of emotional energy. Love didn't vanish because it was no longer concentrated in a single relationship. It could expand into new forms. Even with these activities, there were moments of acute loneliness, particularly on holidays and family gatherings. Seeing other families interact in ways I had once taken for granted sometimes left me feeling invisible, as though my role had been erased. In those moments, I allowed myself to acknowledge the pain, to feel it fully without judgment. Suppressing it would have only deepened the wound. Instead, I embraced it as part of the process, a natural reaction to a profound change in my life. I began journaling more intentionally, not just about my son or our relationship, but about my own desires, reflections, and ambitions. I asked myself questions like, what makes me happy now? What kind of relationships do I want to cultivate? How can I honor my past while fully engaging in the present? The answers weren't immediate, nor were they always clear, but the practice itself was grounding. Writing became a dialogue with myself, a way to explore both grief and growth in tandem. One of the most unexpected realizations came from listening to my son in a new light. During a phone call, he described a challenge he faced at work and asked for my advice. It wasn't a long conversation, but it was significant because it reminded me that he still valued my perspective, even though our day-to-day lives no longer intertwined. I felt pride, not just in his accomplishments, but in the recognition that our bond had adapted rather than vanished. It was a subtle reassurance that love, when nurtured thoughtfully, could endure across distance and change. Gradually, I also began confronting some difficult truths about my own behavior over the years. I recognized patterns of over-involvement, tendencies to micromanage, and subtle pressures that may have unintentionally created distance between us. Accepting these imperfections was humbling, but also liberating. I understood that the relationship was a two-way street, shaped by both parties, and that taking responsibility for my part allowed me to engage more consciously and compassionately moving forward. The process of rebuilding my relationship with my son required patience, empathy, and deliberate restraint. I learned to resist the urge to dominate conversations with my anxieties, to avoid imposing my expectations, and instead to create space for him to express himself freely. Listening became as important as speaking, sometimes more so. I realized that respecting his autonomy, his marriage, his choices, his life, was not a betrayal of our bond, but a necessary step in preserving it. Evenings, once a time of acute longing, began to change subtly. I would still feel pangs of absence, but they were tempered by reflection, meditation, and gratitude. I found joy in solitary activities, reading a compelling novel, taking long walks through familiar streets, cooking a new recipe from start to finish. These moments reminded me that my life had intrinsic value, independent of my son's presence, and that fulfillment could emerge from within, even amidst longing. My social circle became increasingly important. Friends became mirrors, confidants, and sources of laughter that lightened the weight of solitude. I learned to ask for support, to lean on others without guilt, and to celebrate shared moments without comparison. Social interactions became a way to diversify my emotional life, ensuring that my attachment to my son remained significant but not all-consuming. There were setbacks, of course. Sometimes I felt a sharp pang of nostalgia that brought me to tears. Other times I felt frustration when I interpreted his behavior as distant or indifferent, but instead of suppressing these feelings, I used them as opportunities for introspection. I asked myself, why does this hurt so much? Is it a reaction to my unmet expectations or a reflection of my own growth? By examining emotions rather than reacting impulsively, I gradually cultivated resilience and emotional literacy. Over time, I also became aware of the subtle but profound shifts in my son's behavior. He began sharing personal thoughts, seeking advice, and occasionally visiting, albeit briefly. Each interaction, though different from our past, felt authentic. I realized that the depth of a relationship is not solely measured by frequency or proximity, but by sincerity, respect, and mutual understanding. The love that had been tested by distance and change was now evolving, richer for the challenge it had endured. Ultimately, I came to understand that being left behind was not a punishment nor a reflection of failure. It was a natural stage in the evolution of life where roles shift, identities expand, and relationships are renegotiated. It required me to embrace complexity, to live with uncertainty, and to find balance between attachment and independence. And in doing so, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed: the capacity to love without clinging, to hope without demanding, and to exist fully even when life takes unexpected turns. Even as I adjusted to this new reality, I couldn't ignore the deeper layers of emotion that continued to surface. There were moments when memories of his childhood, his small victories, the laughter echoing through our home, the quiet evenings spent reading together, would wash over me with an intensity that was almost physical. I realized that part of my journey was learning to honor these memories without allowing them to tether me to a past that could not be reclaimed. Nostalgia was not an enemy. It was a reminder of love's permanence, even when its expression changed. I began exploring ways to maintain connection without overstepping boundaries. Letters became a tool, carefully written, heartfelt, and sometimes humorous, sent without expectation of immediate response. I found satisfaction in articulating thoughts I might not express verbally, in capturing fleeting emotions and reflections that otherwise might have been lost. These letters were not demands or reminders. They were gifts, offering my son insight into my world while respecting his autonomy. Simultaneously, I developed a routine that prioritized my own emotional and physical well-being. Exercise, meditation, and mindful eating became not just self-care rituals, but affirmations of my worth, independent of my role as a mother. I realized that caring for myself was not selfish, it was essential. By maintaining balance, I could engage with my son from a place of fullness rather than depletion, ensuring that my love for him remained nurturing rather than clinging. I also sought therapy, which proved transformative. Speaking with a trained professional allowed me to process grief, anxiety, and lingering guilt in a structured environment. We examined patterns from the past, identifying moments where my attachment had been overly controlling or where I had neglected to validate my son's autonomy. This introspection wasn't about assigning blame, but understanding dynamics so that I could navigate the present more thoughtfully. Therapy became a space of clarity and empowerment, reinforcing the idea that personal growth often requires guided reflection. As time passed, I became increasingly aware of the subtleties in our communication. A text with a single emoji, a brief phone call to share an observation, a shared photograph, these small acts carried profound significance. I learned to read between the lines, to appreciate nuance, and to recognize that intimacy is not always loud or obvious. Our relationship no longer revolved around constant interaction, but around quality, authenticity, and mutual respect. I also noticed that my own perspective on marriage and partnership shifted. Watching my son navigate his new life reminded me that love is multifaceted. It encompasses joy, compromise, patience, and sometimes separation. Witnessing his efforts to create a partnership of his own challenged me to rethink my expectations of relationships in general, both familial and personal. I realized that attachment is healthiest when it is flexible, allowing those we love to grow while remaining a source of support rather than constraint. One of the most poignant moments came unexpectedly. My son invited me to his home for a casual weekend visit, not a celebration, not a holiday, just a shared meal. Seeing him in his domestic space, observing the life he was building, I felt a mixture of pride, longing, and awe. He was still my child, but also a man who had carved out his own identity, complete with challenges, victories, and routines that did not revolve around me. The experience was bittersweet, yet deeply affirming. During this period, I also revisited friendships that had waned over the years. Reconnecting with people who had witnessed my earlier parenting struggles offered perspective. They reminded me that while my son's absence changed the shape of my life, it did not diminish its value. These friendships became anchors, grounding me in community and offering emotional reciprocity that complemented the evolving bond with my son. I became more intentional about celebrating milestones, both mine and his. Instead of feeling diminished by his achievements, I learned to honor them as reflections of the values and love I had instilled. Likewise, I celebrated my own progress, the small victories of independence, the courage to embrace solitude, the resilience to face emotional discomfort. Life had become a series of interwoven narratives, each deserving recognition, each reinforcing the other. There were moments, admittedly, when I felt vulnerable to regression. A long phone call, a nostalgic social media post, or a reminder of past routines could pull me back into old patterns of longing and anxiety. But I found that acknowledging these lapses, rather than criticizing myself for them, allowed me to recover more quickly. Emotional resilience, I discovered, is not about never feeling pain. It is about learning to navigate it with awareness and compassion. The holidays, once a period of acute loneliness, became an opportunity for adaptation. I established new rituals, blending old traditions with fresh experiences. I invited friends and neighbors to share meals, created art-centered activities that became annual highlights, and even traveled to new places to celebrate change. These shifts did not erase nostalgia, but they allowed me to integrate it into a broader, more fulfilling context. In reflecting on the evolving parent-child relationship, I began studying attachment theory and family dynamics more seriously. Understanding that my son's need for independence was a natural stage of development provided intellectual validation for my emotional experiences. It was not a personal rejection, it was a developmental milestone that required me to step back gracefully, offering support without interference. This awareness reduced anxiety and allowed me to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. I also noticed how my son's choices influenced my interactions with others. I became more patient, more accepting of individuality, and less judgmental. Seeing him negotiate boundaries, assert preferences, and pursue his own happiness inspired me to embrace the same principles in my friendships, professional life, and personal pursuits. His independence became a mirror reflecting possibilities for my own growth. By now, I had developed a nuanced understanding of love as something that evolves. It was no longer about proximity or control, but about presence, even at a distance. I realized that love could be patient, respectful, and self-sustaining, capable of supporting growth on both sides of the relationship. My bond with my son, though altered, had not diminished, it had transformed, gaining depth and resilience through adaptation. Even the moments of tension, misunderstandings, missed calls, conflicting schedules became exercises in patience and empathy. I learned to approach them with curiosity rather than defensiveness, seeking understanding rather than imposing expectations. This approach gradually reshaped our interactions, fostering communication that was less reactive and more intentional, less loaded with past grievances, and more oriented toward present connection. My professional life also benefited from these insights. I became more attuned to boundaries, more empathetic in collaboration, and more reflective in leadership roles. Understanding the dynamics of attachment, autonomy, and respect within my family illuminated similar patterns in the workplace, allowing me to cultivate healthier, more balanced professional relationships. Ultimately, this phase of my journey reinforced a profound truth. Relationships are living entities, subject to change, growth, and adaptation. The bond with my son was not weaker for the distance, it was different, and in its difference lay the potential for richer understanding, mutual respect, and enduring connection. Learning to navigate this reality required humility, reflection, and patience, but it yielded rewards that were deeply gratifying. Even as I settled into this new rhythm, I realized that healing and acceptance were not linear processes. There were days when a simple reminder, like an empty chair at the dinner table or a message left unanswered, could trigger a surge of longing that felt almost physical. These moments were not signs of weakness, but of deep attachment, evidence of the bond I shared with my son. I learned to honor these feelings without allowing them to dictate my actions, acknowledging the heartache while continuing to build a life independent of it. I began exploring creative outlets as a form of emotional expression. Writing became more than letters to my son. It was a way to articulate complex emotions, explore hypothetical scenarios, and even imagine conversations that might never occur. I painted too, letting colors and textures convey what words could not fully capture. Music, often a background in earlier years, became a deliberate practice. Melodies that reflected melancholy, hope, resilience, and love. These activities were cathartic, grounding me while providing channels for self-expression and reflection. Community engagement also offered unexpected solace. Volunteering at local shelters, mentoring young adults, and participating in neighborhood initiatives reminded me that my capacity to give was not confined to my role as a mother. Each connection reinforced the idea that love manifests in many forms and that nurturing others, whether children, peers, or strangers, was a testament to the values I had instilled in my son. These experiences subtly shifted my focus outward, reducing the intensity of personal longing while enhancing a sense of purpose. I noticed changes in the way I communicated with my son. Instead of relying on long emotional messages that carried implicit expectations, I began sending concise, thoughtful notes that emphasized curiosity and shared interests. Asking about his hobbies, commenting on his achievements, or recounting a funny anecdote from my own day created touchpoints for connection without pressure. I discovered that brevity, paired with genuine interest, could strengthen bonds far more effectively than lengthy expressions of concern or nostalgia. As I observed his marriage and personal growth from a respectful distance, I began reflecting on the nature of legacy. What did it mean to pass on values, love, and resilience without imposing control? How could I ensure that the foundation I had built was strong enough for him to thrive independently? These questions were less about pride and more about trust. Trust in the life I had nurtured and trust in the choices he was making. Acceptance became a conscious practice, a daily reaffirmation that the ultimate goal of parenting was not possession, but empowerment. I also grappled with the delicate balance between presence and intrusion. There were times when I felt the urge to intervene, to offer advice unasked, or to correct perceived missteps. Experience and reflection taught me that these impulses, though natural, often risked undermining the respect I sought to cultivate. I learned to pause, observe, and respond selectively, understanding that my son's growth depended on both guidance and autonomy. This restraint became a form of love in itself, a silent affirmation that I trusted his judgment and respected his journey. Financial independence played a role in my emotional freedom as well. By cultivating professional growth, managing resources wisely, and pursuing personal projects, I experienced a sense of agency that was distinct from my identity as a parent. Achievements in my own right reinforced the understanding that life could be fulfilling beyond familial roles. This independence did not lessen my love for my son. Rather, it modeled resilience, ambition, and adaptability, qualities I hoped he would see and internalize as he built his own life. I began noticing patterns in how our interactions shifted over time. Initially, every call or message was fraught with expectation, anxiety, or a subtle need for reassurance. Gradually, the tone evolved into one of mutual respect, curiosity, and shared humor. We laughed more, shared insights, and celebrated each other's small victories without the weight of past dependency. The transformation was subtle yet profound, a testament to the enduring strength of relationships nurtured through patience, understanding, and conscious adaptation. Social media presented both opportunities and challenges. Observing snippets of my son's life online could trigger jealousy or longing if approached without mindfulness. I decided to engage selectively, appreciating the joy in his milestones without comparing them to my own timeline or imposing silent judgment. This practice of mindful observation helped maintain connection while preserving emotional equilibrium, allowing me to participate in his life without feeling overshadowed or excluded. I also reflected on the nature of forgiveness and letting go, not of mistakes or failings, but of expectations, holding tightly to preconceived notions of how my son should live or interact would only hinder the bond we shared. By releasing rigid expectations, I created space for authenticity, honesty, and mutual respect. This shift transformed interactions that were once tense or anxiety-laden into opportunities for genuine exchange, where love could flow unimpeded by fear or judgment. Travel became another avenue for growth. Experiencing new cultures, environments, and perspectives reminded me that life extends beyond familiar routines and attachments. These journeys cultivated curiosity, resilience, and adaptability, while also providing stories and experiences to share with my son, bridging distance through conversation and shared imagination. Travel underscored the idea that the world is vast, relationships are dynamic, and life continues to offer meaning even as familiar patterns evolve. I also deepened my understanding of emotional intelligence. I became more attuned to subtle cues, both in myself and in my son. I learned to differentiate between longing and need, observation and judgment, support and interference. This awareness enhanced my ability to respond thoughtfully, fostering interactions characterized by empathy, patience, and mutual understanding. I realized that mastering emotional intelligence was not just beneficial for parenting, but essential for all meaningful relationships. Witnessing my son's role as a partner illuminated the interplay of love, compromise, and shared responsibility. Observing him navigate challenges with patience, negotiation, and empathy offered profound insight into adult relationships. It also highlighted the importance of humility and flexibility in maintaining harmony. Lessons I had long hoped he would internalize, now vividly demonstrated in his choices. I marveled at his growth and recognized that my earlier guidance, though imperfect, had contributed to the foundation upon which he built. In quieter moments, I began journaling reflections that were intended for no one but myself. These records chronicled the evolution of our relationship, my inner emotional landscape, and my personal growth. Revisiting these entries later provided perspective, revealing patterns of resilience, adaptation, and transformation that I had not consciously recognized. Writing became a mirror, allowing me to see not only where I had been but also where I was heading. Gradually, I noticed a new type of satisfaction, the joy of being proud without needing validation, the pleasure of caring without expectation, and the serenity of loving without clinging. These realizations were subtle but powerful, reshaping my approach to my son, to myself, and to life at large. I learned that love's deepest expression often requires patience, restraint, and trust, qualities that ultimately strengthen connection rather than diminish it. Through all these experiences, I came to understand a profound truth. Letting go does not mean losing. My son's life, though increasingly independent of mine, did not signify the end of our bond. Rather, it represented a transformation, a maturation of love that embraced freedom, respect, and mutual understanding. Each milestone he achieved, each choice he made, became a testament to the enduring strength of the relationship we had cultivated over years of care, guidance, and shared experiences. As I approached this new chapter, I realized that the nature of connection had fundamentally shifted. The bond with my son, once characterized by proximity and routine, was now defined by intentionality and quality. Every conversation, every message, every shared memory carried more weight because it was chosen rather than obligatory. I learned to cherish these moments with a depth that I hadn't experienced before, understanding that the scarcity of interaction could actually enhance its richness. One of the most striking lessons was that love is not diminished by distance, it evolves. I watched my son establish routines, celebrate milestones, and navigate challenges in his own way. Initially, this independence stirred a mix of pride and quiet ache, but over time, the pride became more dominant, anchored in the realization that my guidance had equipped him to stand firmly on his own. I began to recognize that our relationship was no longer a tether, but a bridge, a structure strong enough to allow him freedom while still supporting connection. As I observed this evolution, I also became more reflective about my own identity. For years, so much of my self-definition revolved around being a parent, the constant planning, worrying, advising, and nurturing. With my son's increasing independence, I discovered spaces within myself that had been dormant: curiosity about the world, personal ambitions, and a deeper engagement with my passions. This self-discovery was liberating. I felt less like a caretaker and more like a complete individual, capable of growth alongside my son rather than entirely for him. Communication became an art form. I learned to craft messages that conveyed interest without pressure, shared stories without expectation, and expressed love without anxiety. Instead of reaching out of habit or worry, I reached out with mindfulness, creating dialogues that were mutually engaging. Sometimes a simple "thinking of you" text or a shared photo sparked warmth and laughter, reinforcing the idea that connection thrives on presence, not constant oversight. I also found strength in setting boundaries, not as a form of control, but as a declaration of self-respect and emotional clarity. These boundaries clarified the terms of our interactions, ensuring that my love and support were sustainable, balanced, and constructive. Over time, my son began to respect this structure intuitively. Our exchanges became smoother, less fraught, and more genuinely joyful. It was a subtle but profound shift. Love guided by conscious care rather than by compulsion or habit. Parenting adult children demands a new kind of patience. I noticed that the urge to correct, advise, or step in had to be tempered by an understanding that mistakes are essential for growth. Watching my son navigate difficulties without interference was often challenging, but it was also enlightening. I came to appreciate the value of experiential learning, of allowing him to own his successes and failures. Each time I resisted the urge to intervene, I was reinforcing trust, both in him and in myself, as a parent capable of letting go. The role of empathy deepened as well. I tried to understand his choices not from the lens of my desires or fears, but from the perspective of his experiences and needs. This empathetic approach transformed conflicts into conversations and misunderstandings into opportunities for dialogue. I realized that maintaining emotional alignment required listening as much as speaking, observing as much as guiding. It was a dynamic dance, one that required constant attention but yielded profound closeness. Social engagements offered another layer of connection. Meeting friends, attending events, and cultivating a social network outside the immediate family sphere created a buffer against loneliness and provided opportunities for shared stories with my son. When I recounted these experiences to him, our exchanges often became richer, peppered with humor, reflection, and insight. Life outside his immediate presence became a resource for engagement rather than a source of absence. I also noticed that joy could be independent of constant communication. Learning to celebrate his milestones quietly, without needing immediate acknowledgement, taught me resilience and humility. Witnessing his accomplishments from afar became an exercise in appreciation rather than control. This shift in perspective strengthened our bond. It was no longer contingent on my involvement in every detail, but rather built on mutual respect and recognition of autonomy. Introspection played a pivotal role in this transformation. I often reflected on my parenting style, my emotional triggers, and my expectations. Writing and journaling allowed me to process complex emotions, explore hypothetical scenarios, and articulate gratitude for the journey we had shared. This practice not only deepened my understanding of myself, but also enhanced my capacity for patience, compassion, and measured engagement with my son. I also explored avenues for mentoring beyond my immediate family, supporting young professionals, volunteering in community programs, and participating in knowledge-sharing initiatives provided a sense of purpose and connection. These experiences reinforced the understanding that nurturing is not limited to parent-child relationships. It is a skill, a mindset, and a practice that can enrich multiple aspects of life. Sharing insights and guidance with others became a way to honor my son's independence while still living my values outwardly. The evolution of my emotional responses was subtle but transformative. Moments that once triggered anxiety, delayed messages, missed calls, or unfamiliar decisions became opportunities for reflection rather than panic. I cultivated a mindset that distinguished between concern, rooted in love, and fear, rooted in attachment. This awareness allowed me to approach our interactions with calmness, clarity, and intentionality, fostering a healthier, more enduring connection. I also noticed the importance of shared history. Memories of family vacations, celebrations, and ordinary routines became touchstones for conversation and emotional reconnection. Revisiting these experiences in conversation, whether through photos, stories, or shared laughter, provided continuity amidst change. The past became a bridge to the present, anchoring our relationship in a narrative of love, growth, and resilience. I embraced flexibility in expectations, recognizing that the life my son was building might not align with my imagined path. Letting go of rigid timelines and ideal scenarios was liberating. It allowed me to celebrate his choices authentically without comparing them to my desires or fears. This approach cultivated mutual respect and strengthened our bond, proving that acceptance can be more powerful than advice when it comes to adult relationships. I also explored practices to nurture mindfulness and presence. Meditation, reflective walks, and conscious breathing exercises helped me remain centered, reducing anxiety about distance and change. These practices reinforce the understanding that love flourishes not through constant oversight, but through presence, awareness, and thoughtful engagement. The ability to remain grounded enhanced both my well-being and the quality of interactions with my son. Witnessing his partnership in marriage provided profound insight. Observing the dynamics of communication, compromise, and empathy within his relationship highlighted lessons I had long hoped he would internalize. These observations affirmed that parenting is not about maintaining control, but about equipping children to navigate life's complexities independently. Each instance of responsible decision-making reinforced the strength of the foundation we had built together. Through these experiences, I came to a more nuanced understanding of pride and fulfillment. My satisfaction shifted from a need for recognition to a quiet, enduring appreciation of his growth and happiness. I realized that parental love can be both selfless and joyful, rooted in observation, trust, and celebration rather than possession or expectation. This mindset brought an unprecedented sense of peace, freeing me to enjoy our evolving connection fully. In the quiet moments between calls, visits, and shared experiences, I often contemplated the meaning of letting go. It was not a one-time act, but an ongoing practice, an exercise in trust, patience, and unconditional love. Accepting that my son's life would diverge from mine in ways I could not control became a source of strength rather than sorrow. I recognized that the most enduring connections are not maintained by proximity or oversight, but by respect, understanding, and the freedom to thrive independently. Ultimately, the transformation was mutual. As my son grew into his life and responsibilities, I grew into mine. We evolved together, not as dependent figures, but as independent individuals, bound by love, shared history, and conscious connection. Our relationship matured into a partnership of trust and mutual respect, demonstrating that parental love does not end with independence. It transforms into something richer, more resilient, and profoundly rewarding.